The silence was heavy in New Delhi when Narendra Modi stepped to the microphone. He didn't sound cautious or diplomatic. He sounded defiant. "India will never compromise on the interest of its farmers," he declared, "and I am ready to pay a very heavy price." His words weren't aimed at Beijing or Moscow, they were aimed at Washington. Hours earlier, Donald Trump had doubled tariffs on Indian exports to a crushing 50%, punishing India for refusing to stop buying Russian oil. The shock landed like a rupture. For the first time in decades, India was asking whether the United States, not China, was the bigger threat to its economic security. The numbers revealed the scale of the blow. The United States is India's largest export market. $87 billion worth of shipments in 2024. Now, more than half that trade was in jeopardy. Auto parts, textiles, steel, gems, all suddenly priced out against competitors in Vietnam and Bangladesh. S.C. Ralhan, head of India's Export Federation, warned that 55% of shipments were at risk. What stunned Delhi wasn't only the economics, but the contradiction. Washington had spent years urging India to counterbalance China. Yet the tariffs pushed India straight into Beijing's orbit. The inconsistency was obvious. Trump justified the punishment as retaliation for Russian oil imports. But China, which buys far more Russian crude, faced no penalties. Turkey also continued purchases without retaliation. To Indian officials, this wasn't strategy. It was double standards. Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, known for his precise and unflinching tone, called India's energy security non-negotiable. He reminded Washington that India imports more than 80% of the oil it needs, and stability for 1.4 billion people could not hinge on another country's politics. The message: India would not be coerced. The rhetoric escalated quickly. Within days, Trump called India's economy dead and accused Modi of profiting from chaos. Only months earlier, Modi had visited the White House, calling Trump a great friend and pledging to double trade to $500 billion. Now, the friendship had curdled into public shaming. Editorials in the Indian press turned bitter. The Hindu insisted that India's sovereignty was, well, non-negotiable. In the Indian Express, Pratap Bhanu Mehta described Trump's strategy as imperialism on steroids. Across India, the mood shifted from disappointment to outright anger. Character mattered here. Modi, who built his political persona on strength and national pride, could not be seen bowing to Washington. Opposition leaders sensed blood. Mallikarjun Kharge demanded retaliatory tariffs. Shashi Tharoor called for equal penalties on U.S. goods. Modi responded not with concession but defiance. India will never compromise on farmers, livestock rearers, or fisherfolk, he declared in a televised address. Protecting farmers, the backbone of India's politics, was non-negotiable. For Modi, whose tone was more fiery than statesmanlike, this was survival at home as much as abroad. The irony was brutal. India had spent years moving closer to the U.S., precisely to reduce reliance on China. After the deadly Galwan Valley clashes in 2020, India banned more than 300 Chinese apps, tightened investment rules, and leaned harder toward Washington. But by mid-2025, the very ally meant to provide security had become the source of volatility. Washington's unpredictability forced India to look again at Beijing. The contradiction was stark. To escape dependence on China, India had embraced the United States. Now, to escape dependence on the U.S., India was reopening doors to China. That recalibration began quietly in October 2024. Modi met Xi Jinping for the first time in 5 years. The two leaders shook hands in public view, a gesture almost unthinkable since the bloody border clashes. Patrols along disputed regions resumed. Beijing restored pilgrimage routes. Civil exchanges reopened. Delhi allowed some Chinese suppliers back into Indian markets after domestic companies reported $15 billion in losses from supply disruptions. It wasn't trust. It was necessity. As one official told Reuters, cutting China out completely is not feasible. In a world where China controlled 60% of global electronics manufacturing, ignoring Beijing was impossible. India's ambition is to build a $300 billion electronics industry by 2026. Without Chinese components, that goal is fantasy. Bloomberg data shows that Chinese suppliers dominate not just electronics, but solar, rare earths, and critical minerals. If Washington's tariffs cut off India's exports while Beijing controlled inputs, New Delhi's economic model would collapse. Modi's pivot wasn't about preference, it was about survival. But pause. Because here's the contradiction no one saw coming. India's turn toward China wasn't driven by admiration for Beijing. It was driven by disillusionment with Washington. For years, the assumption was that India's democracy bound it naturally to the United States. Yet, Trump's tariffs exposed the flaw. Loyalty offered no protection. In fact, loyalty became a liability when India's choices diverged. Trump even equated Modi with Pakistan's generals, praising both in the same breath. To India's strategic elite, this was more than insult. It was proof the partnership was transactional. The supposed natural alliance suddenly looked disposable. Which raises the new question. If Washington can't be trusted to uphold predictability, what options remain for India? The United States isn't just a trade partner. It supplies advanced defense systems, technology collaborations, and space missions. Could India pivot toward China without compromising its own security? Or was the pivot simply a hedge, buying time against America's volatility? This is the dilemma shaping Delhi's calculations. Meanwhile, energy dependence deepened the stakes. Russia now supplies over 30% of India's crude imports, up from less than 1% in 2021. That surge is no accident. Discounted Russian oil fuels India's middle class, and cutting it off would spike domestic prices. The International Energy Agency projects that India may surpass China as the world's largest oil importer by 2030. If true, rejecting discounted supplies under United States pressure would be strategically reckless. India framed the choice as sovereignty. Washington framed it as disloyalty. The gap was unbridgeable. Yet contradictions persisted. Even as trade tensions spiked, cooperation with the United States continued. On the same day Trump announced tariffs, India and NASA launched the joint NISAR satellite. Silicon Valley firms still expanded operations in Bangalore. Defense cooperation remained active. The paradox was cinematic confrontation in one sphere, collaboration in another. It illustrated the complexity of modern alliances. India was not abandoning Washington, but it was making clear it would not be cornered by it. Modi, visibly proud yet under fire, positioned himself as a defender of sovereignty. Trump, volatile and transactional, played to domestic politics, portraying India as defiant rather than aligned. Xi Jinping, by contrast, appeared patient, measured, offering predictability in trade. And Jaishankar, in his clipped diplomatic style, framed India's stance as non-negotiable without theatrics. Each character embodied a different logic: defiance, volatility, control, precision. Then came the Pakistan factor. Trump hosted Pakistan's army chief at the White House, signed preferential trade deals, and even suggested Pakistan might one day sell oil to India. For Delhi, this was humiliation. For decades, United States leaders had respected India's red line: no mediation in Kashmir. Trump bulldozed it. Publicly claiming credit for a ceasefire India insisted never involved outside actors. To Delhi's establishment, this wasn't mere provocation, it was betrayal. If Washington treated India and Pakistan as equals, what was left of the so-called special relationship? India's exports to the United States stood at $86 billion. But with tariffs under 50%, a lot of that trade just isn't viable anymore. India actually accounts for only about 2% of global exports, so it really can't absorb such a big loss without diversifying. That means, looking to Europe, Africa, and Latin America, markets where, honestly, China already has a strong foothold. If India wants to reduce its dependence on China, it actually has to work in areas where China is already setting the rules. So in practice, that means re-engaging with Beijing instead of just isolating it. By now, the irony was inescapable. Trump's tariffs, designed to pressure India into alignment, strengthened Beijing's hand instead. Chinese suppliers regained space in Indian markets. Chinese diplomats re-entered dialogues. For Washington, the strategy backfired. Instead of isolating Russia and China, it risked isolating India. As Walter Ladwig of King's College London observed, this was the most serious public rift in years. For U.S. policymakers, the loss of Indian trust could undo decades of Indo-Pacific strategy. For Beijing, the benefits required no effort, just patience. Modi's government reports that agriculture accounts for over 45% of India's employment. U.S. pressure to open markets to American farm and dairy products would devastate this sector. No Indian Prime Minister, BJP, or Congress could concede on that point. It's a red line written into India's political DNA. By demanding concessions on agriculture while weaponizing tariffs, Washington ensured a deadlock. From India's perspective, the U.S. wasn't negotiating, it was dictating. That approach turned a partner into a problem. The closing irony sharpens the frame. Washington sought to punish India for buying Russian oil and restrain Beijing's influence in Asia. Instead, it accelerated both. Russia is now more entrenched as India's energy lifeline. China is back in play as India's supply chain partner. And India, far from aligning with Washington, is asserting the doctrine of strategic autonomy with more force than ever. Trump's tariffs were meant to corner India. Instead, they exposed the limits of American leverage. In the end, this isn't a story of India choosing China. It's a story of India refusing to be chosen for. Modi's defiance, Jaishankar's bluntness, Xi's patience, Trump's volatility, all collided in a single contradiction. Or alliances without trust are liabilities. What began with tariffs on textiles and steel has become a realignment of global power. The U.S. wanted loyalty, India wanted autonomy, and in that collision, Washington is losing its grip. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.